AITA for calling off the wedding after my fiancé gave his ex closure without telling me? I was 25 when I met Tom. Just a regular Friday night at a bar with friends that somehow turned into one of those serendipitous nights where everything changes. We had an easy chemistry. The kind that feels effortless. With conversation that flowed like we'd known each other forever. Tom was funny and sharp. A little rough around the edges but in a charming, captivating way. It didn't take long before I was head over heels. And soon we were inseparable. Talking about marriage, family, and all the dreams people share when they think they've found their person. By the time we got engaged, it felt like we were building something strong and real. A future based on genuine friendship and love. Every detail of our lives seemed to intertwine seamlessly. And I was genuinely excited to start this new chapter with him. We talked about moving out of our apartment and buying a house. Imagined what it would be like to raise kids. And made plans for all the little things that make up a life together. Our wedding was supposed to be the beginning of it all. A symbol of what we'd worked for. A promise to each other in front of everyone we loved. But then, there was Sarah. Sarah was Tom's ex. And she was there before me. Around for years before I even entered the picture. Tom and Sarah had been together for 6 years. Almost as long as we'd been together. And from what he told me, they'd been serious. She was his first everything. As he put it, his first real love. His first long-term partner. He told me they'd parted ways mutually. Agreeing they had grown apart and wanted different things. Which I accepted. Everyone has a past, right? And I wanted to respect that Tom's included her. At first, I even sympathized with her. I'd been through breakups that left me raw. That made me question who I was and where I was going. I knew how much it hurt to let go of someone you once believed you'd be with forever. So, I tried to be understanding about Sarah. Tom mentioned her a few times in our first year together. And while it stung slightly, I pushed that aside, figuring it was a part of his past that he just needed to process. After all, I wasn't looking for any drama or insecurity to mess up what we had. I wanted to be the understanding girlfriend. The kind of person who didn't feel threatened by ghosts of relationships past. But as our relationship deepened and Tom and I grew closer, it started to bother me how Sarah seemed to linger in his life like a distant, invisible presence. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of her in Tom's old photos. Or he'd mention a mutual friend who had bumped into her. She was like a shadow that slipped in through the smallest of cracks. A reminder of the life Tom had before me that I'd never be a part of. I convinced myself it was normal. She was a part of his history. Just like I'd had my share of exes and lessons learned. Tom reassured me whenever I voiced my unease. And for a while, I believed him. But now, with our wedding approaching, it was harder for me to ignore how her presence still hung in the air between us. I would brush it off, rationalizing it as a me problem, telling myself I was overreacting. He had proposed to me. And I believed in that promise. I was his future, she was just his past. And that was how I wanted to see it. We started planning the wedding. And I felt our life together crystallizing in my mind. Each detail adding another layer to my excitement. I could picture it all, standing at the altar. The glow of happiness in Tom's eyes. The life we would begin together. I believed with every part of me that we were finally moving past whatever history he had with Sarah. That she was a closed chapter in his book. I assumed he felt the same way. I was wrong. It was a quiet Tuesday night when I noticed it. Something that seemed so small at first it barely registered. Tom's phone buzzed on the coffee table. And a notification flashed briefly across the screen before disappearing. I didn't think anything of it. Not at first. But then I saw the name. Sarah. My heart dropped. That cold, sinking feeling of dread pooling in my stomach. We were sitting together, watching a movie, and I tried to keep my expression neutral, reminding myself that I trusted him, that this was nothing. But as much as I tried to ignore it, a strange sense of unease settled over me. Sarah hadn't come up in a while, and a part of me had assumed she'd finally faded into the background. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that maybe she was just tying up some loose end from years ago. Something insignificant. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Later, when Tom was out of the room, I glanced at his phone again, now abandoned on the counter. Normally, I wouldn't even think of invading his privacy like that. But my curiosity, mixed with a strange sense of betrayal, won out. I opened the Messages app, my pulse quickening as I read the last few words of her message. Thanks for last night. Last night, those 3 words sent a chill through me. Tom had stayed out late the previous night, saying he was out with some friends. I didn't think much of it at the time. I trusted him. I told myself over and over that he deserved the benefit of the doubt. But seeing her words, thanks for last night, made everything inside me freeze. I could feel the blood drain from my face, and a strange nausea twisted in my stomach as questions, suspicions, and fears flared to life. I waited for him to come back into the room, each second stretching out painfully. When he did, I confronted him. I kept my voice steady, trying not to reveal how shattered I felt. I simply asked him why Sarah had thanked him for last night. For a moment, Tom's face went blank, a flicker of something I couldn't place, guilt, panic, maybe surprise, crossing his expression before he quickly masked it. He sat down and took a deep breath, launching into an explanation that felt both rushed and overly calm. He said that Sarah had reached out to him recently, asking for closure. She had told him that she needed one last conversation to put their past behind her and move on. I listened, numb, as he explained how she'd poured her heart out to him, telling him how much their relationship had meant, how it had shaped her. And he'd listened, he said, as though this was some noble favor he was doing for her. Then, as the night stretched on, he admitted that he'd stayed longer than he'd intended, talking with her until early morning. It was just talking, he said, his voice almost pleading. She needed closure, and I thought it would help her move on. Nothing happened, I promise. I wanted to believe him. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting, that his explanation was enough, that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. But it didn't explain why he hadn't told me, why he'd lied by omission, why he hadn't even mentioned that she'd reached out in the first place. If it was as innocent as he said, wouldn't he have told me from the start? He could see the doubt in my face, and instead of trying to understand my side, he grew defensive. He accused me of being insecure, of blowing things out of proportion. You're overthinking it, he said, his voice laced with frustration. You should trust me. Trust. That word stung like a slap. Trust was the very thing he'd taken for granted by hiding this from me. And now he was trying to make me feel like I was in the wrong for doubting him. He kept insisting that nothing physical had happened, that it was just words, just a conversation, but the way he'd hidden it made me feel like it was more than that. And every time he told me I was being too emotional or paranoid, I felt my faith in him slipping further. I didn't know what hurt more, the fact that he'd lied or the fact that he seemed to have no remorse for it. I tried to make him understand, to explain why his secrecy had hurt me, why it made me question everything. But he kept pushing back, brushing off my concerns, making me feel like I was the problem, like I was the one bringing unnecessary drama into our relationship. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, he dropped a line that made my stomach turn. This needed to happen, he said, his tone firm, for me to move on completely. Move on? The implication was staggering. Here I was, his fiancé, the person he was supposedly committed to building a future with. And he was telling me he needed a private meeting with his ex to move on. He didn't see it as a betrayal, as a breach of trust. In his mind, he had done something necessary. And I was the one who needed to understand that. The hurt in my chest turned to anger. How could he expect me to see this as anything but a violation of our relationship? As I went to bed that night, a million questions swirled through my mind. I replayed every detail of our relationship, every assurance he'd given me that his past was behind him. I wanted to forgive him, to put it behind us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was irreversibly cracked. The man I'd thought was my forever had met with his ex in secret. And instead of remorse, he'd given me indifference. In that moment, I felt my certainty slipping, the foundation of my future with him starting to erode beneath my feet. The next morning, I felt like I was in a haze, replaying our conversation from the night before, hoping that maybe I'd overreacted, That somehow I could rationalize what Tom had done and move forward. I tried to convince myself that it was just a slip in judgment on his part. That he'd done it for innocent reasons. Just as he'd claimed. But every time I thought about it, I could feel the resentment and confusion pooling inside me. My thoughts cycling through every worst-case scenario. Later that day, I tried bringing it up again, hoping to reach some understanding. I wanted to hear something, anything, that would make this all make sense. I told myself to stay calm, to keep my voice even, but the frustration and hurt I'd been bottling up all night crept into my words. I asked him again why he hadn't told me, why he'd felt the need to keep this hidden if it was truly so innocent. As I spoke, I could see the exasperation building on his face, and something inside me twisted. It wasn't guilt or regret I saw there. It was irritation. He looked at me as though I were a child who didn't understand. Like I was the one making an issue out of something trivial. He didn't get it. He didn't seem to care. "You're making this into something it's not," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react like this. It was just a conversation. Nothing happened, and I didn't think it was worth bringing up. I don't understand why you're blowing this out of proportion." I tried to keep my voice steady, to hold on to some shred of dignity, but every word he spoke felt like salt in an open wound. Did he really think I'd just sit back and pretend everything was fine? Even after he'd lied? The more he tried to paint this as an overreaction, the more furious I felt. My feelings weren't the problem. His secrecy, his defensiveness, that was the problem. But no matter how I tried to explain it, he wouldn't listen. I told him that what hurt the most wasn't the conversation itself but the fact that he'd chosen to hide it from me. That he'd made a decision about our relationship without including me in it. I explained that I'd been left in the dark while he'd confided in his ex, making me feel like I was somehow outside our relationship. I tried to make him understand that this wasn't about jealousy, that it was about trust and respect. But the more I spoke, the more he pushed back, his voice turning harsher. "I shouldn't have to walk on eggshells around you," he snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. "You act like I'm cheating on you just because I had a conversation. This is your insecurity, not my issue. Maybe if you trusted me, we wouldn't be having this fight." Each word cut deeper, and I felt myself shrinking under his accusations. Like my feelings were irrational and unworthy of consideration. I wanted so badly to believe that I was wrong, that maybe he was right and I was being overly sensitive. But another part of me, the part that clung to self-respect, knew this wasn't fair. I wasn't the one who'd lied, who'd gone behind his partner's back. He kept going, his words sharp and defensive, as though he needed to push me further into a corner to make himself feel justified. He threw around words like insecure and controlling, trying to make me feel like I was somehow in the wrong. That this was all a reflection of my shortcomings instead of his betrayal. With every accusation, I felt myself slipping further into a state of disbelief. A cold numbness settling over me as I realized just how little he seemed to care about my perspective. I looked at him, trying to find some trace of the man I thought I knew. The one who had promised to cherish me, to be my partner. But all I saw was a stranger. Someone who seemed more committed to protecting his ego than repairing the damage he'd caused. In that moment, I understood that he didn't see what he'd done as a betrayal. To him, it was a minor issue. Something he'd brushed off and expected me to accept without question. And then he said something that made my stomach turn. "Honestly, if you're this jealous of a friendship, maybe you're not as ready for marriage as you think," he muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough for me to hear. The words hit me like a slap, leaving me momentarily speechless. I felt the tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I swallowed them down, refusing to let him see how much he was hurting me. I couldn't believe he was trying to turn this around on me, making me feel like I was the one who wasn't ready for commitment. It was so absurd, so unfair, that for a moment I almost laughed. But the anger quickly overshadowed everything else. I'd never felt so dismissed, so minimized by someone I loved. He was supposed to be my partner, my confidant, and yet here he was, standing on the other side of this divide he'd created, acting like I was the unreasonable one. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to entertain. I could feel something breaking inside me. Something I'd held onto for so long, my trust in him. My belief that we were on the same side. And as I lay there, my heart aching with the weight of everything unsaid, I began to question if this was the person I was supposed to spend my life with. If he was someone who could ever truly see and respect me. For the first time, I felt the possibility of leaving him as a real option. A flickering thought that grew with each passing moment. I didn't want to admit it. Didn't want to believe that this man I'd planned a future with was capable of making me feel so alone. But as I lay there in the silence of our shared apartment, the feeling settled deep in my chest. A mix of heartbreak and realization that maybe, just maybe, I was seeing him clearly for the first time. As the days passed, I could feel an invisible wall between us. Something heavy and unspoken that neither of us wanted to touch. I found myself clinging to the fragments of our relationship, trying to piece together what was left. I'd always thought of Tom as my rock, my safe place, and yet now I felt like I was navigating a minefield of secrets, unspoken doubts, and the gnawing sense that maybe I was the only one truly invested in protecting what we had. The more I reflected on our fight, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Sarah. Sure, she was the catalyst, but there were other moments that I'd overlooked. Things I'd brushed aside as quirks or misunderstandings. Now, I was seeing them through a new lens. And I couldn't ignore the patterns emerging before me. For one, there was Tom's constant need to keep the peace. He'd always brushed off uncomfortable topics. Whether it was a disagreement over our future, boundaries in our relationship, or even something as simple as family plans. He would downplay everything, smoothing things over with an easy smile or a joke, making me feel like my concerns were trivial. I'd never pressed him on it, assuming that was just his way of avoiding conflict. But now, I could see that this habit wasn't about keeping the peace. It was about keeping me at arm's length. Holding onto control by shutting down conversations that might challenge his choices. Then there were his friendships. Looking back, I could remember multiple instances when he'd been overly invested in certain friendships with women, always downplaying them as just friends. I had convinced myself that I was just being paranoid, that I had no reason to feel threatened by these friendships. But now, those same friendships didn't feel quite as innocent as he'd made them out to be. They all carried this undertone of ambiguity, a sense that he kept people around for reasons that went beyond friendship. Even if he'd never acted on it in a physical sense. It wasn't the friendship with Sarah itself that hurt. It was the fact that he'd kept her on a pedestal, preserving her in some untouchable way, as if she were this permanent fixture in his life that I just have to accept. And if I questioned it, then suddenly I was the one with the problem, the one who was insecure, untrusting, or too emotional. Each accusation echoed in my mind, a reminder of how easily he dismissed my feelings. One night, as I lay in bed, I tried to work up the courage to bring this up again. To tell him how deeply it bothered me that he seemed unable to let go of Sarah. He was lying next to me, scrolling on his phone, completely oblivious to the storm of emotions building inside me. When I finally broke the silence, he sighed and put his phone down, turning to me with a look of exhausted patience, like he was already bracing for another round of what he saw as petty arguments. I told him that I needed him to hear me out without judgment. That this wasn't about jealousy but about respect and honesty. I asked him how he would feel if I'd gone out with an ex for closure, without telling him. If I'd kept him in the dark about something that mattered so much to me. I wanted him to understand that trust was built on transparency, on making sure your partner felt valued and safe. But his response was as cold as it had been before. I don't know why you're so obsessed with this. He muttered. I told you. It's done. I'm with you. Sarah was part of my life. And she deserved a proper goodbye. Why is that so hard for you to understand? He couldn't see the depth of what he was saying. He couldn't see that by calling it proper. He was putting Sarah's needs above mine. Above the trust we'd worked to build. I realized in that moment that he didn't see his actions as hurtful. Because in his mind, he was just fulfilling some imaginary obligation he had to his past. And I was expected to understand. To accept it as some kind of proof of his maturity, of his ability to move on. But how could he be moving on when he was still holding on to her? I could feel the tears welling up. But I forced them back, unwilling to show him just how deeply he'd cut me. Instead, I swallowed my pride and asked him, one last time, if he saw how painful this was for me. How rejected it made me feel. His response shattered any hope I had of reaching him. You know, maybe this is your issue to work through, he said, his tone clipped and dismissive. I can't keep apologizing just because you're insecure. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. My insecurity, my issue. It was like he decided to rewrite our entire relationship as a flaw in my character. A shortcoming I'd have to address if I wanted to keep him around. I felt something inside me snap. A line that had held strong through so much doubt and fear suddenly giving way. I left the room, my heart pounding as I tried to steady my breathing. To process the enormity of what had just happened, I realized, with a painful clarity, that Tom didn't understand trust in the same way I did. To him, trust was something I was supposed to give blindly, without question. To me, trust was a bond we both worked to protect. A foundation that needed to be nurtured and respected. And somewhere along the way, he'd stopped caring about that. As I lay on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling, I thought about all the times I'd let things slide. All the moments I'd told myself that my concerns weren't worth bringing up. I'd been so focused on keeping the peace, on preserving the relationship we'd built, that I'd ignored my own needs, my own boundaries, and for what? To protect a man who didn't value my feelings, who couldn't see beyond his own ego. That night, I came to a painful realization. I'd been second place in my own relationship. Second to Sarah, second to Tom's ego, second to his need to keep control. He'd kept me at a distance, wrapped up in his version of what our relationship should look like. And I'd let him. I'd been so afraid of losing him that I'd sacrificed my self-worth along the way. I knew then that something had to change. This wasn't just a single mistake he could apologize for. This was a fundamental difference in how we viewed love, respect, and commitment. And as much as I wanted to salvage what we had, I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. For the first time since we'd gotten engaged, I felt the cold, hard weight of doubt settling in my chest. This was bigger than a single betrayal. It was a pattern, a disregard for my feelings that I couldn't ignore any longer. A week passed, each day weighed down with an awkward, fragile silence. Tom and I drifted through our routines like strangers, both unwilling to address the chasm growing between us. I found myself stuck in this constant loop, torn between my love for him and the gnawing feeling that something fundamental was broken. I spent hours replaying our last conversation in my head, trying to figure out where we had gone so wrong, hoping for some epiphany that would pull me out of this fog of hurt and disappointment. Then, just as I thought we might finally be moving past it, Tom dropped a bombshell that shattered any remaining illusions I'd held onto. We were at home one evening, sitting at the kitchen table, going over the list of wedding details that felt more like a chore than a celebration at this point. Tom seemed unusually chipper, which struck me as odd, given the tension that had been hanging over us. I tried to match his energy, forcing a smile and making polite conversation. But the unresolved pain lingered just beneath the surface. As he glanced over our guest list, he looked up at me, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Hey, I've been thinking, he began casually, like he was about to suggest a new color for the bridesmaids' dresses. I think it would be nice if we invited Sarah to the wedding. The words hit me like a physical blow. My stomach twisted, and I felt the color drain from my face. I searched his face for any hint that he was joking, waiting for him to laugh it off as some terrible attempt at humor. But there was nothing, just that slight, oblivious smile, as though he'd just made a perfectly reasonable suggestion. I could barely process it. He was seriously proposing that his ex, the same ex he'd secretly met up with for closure, should attend our wedding. The same ex who'd loomed over our relationship like a ghost for the entirety of our time together. The ex who, just weeks ago, he'd felt the need to console, to properly say goodbye to in the dead of night. And he thought it would be nice to invite her to witness our commitment to each other? I managed to stammer out a few words, my voice shaky with disbelief. You want Sarah at our wedding? He nodded, his expression unchanging. As if he'd suggested nothing more controversial than adding an extra guest to the seating chart. Yeah, I mean, she was a big part of my life. And it would be a good way to show everyone there's no bad blood. Like, we've all moved on, and there's no need for lingering tension. You know? I didn't know. I didn't know anything. Apparently, I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me, leaving me standing on an edge that I hadn't even realized was there. I'd known Tom had an odd sense of loyalty toward his past. But this was something else. I wanted to scream, to ask him how he could even think of doing this, how he could be so utterly oblivious to the pain it was causing me. But all I could do was stare at him, stunned into silence. As I struggled to compose myself, I asked, Tom, why would you think inviting her is appropriate? My voice was small, barely more than a whisper. But I forced myself to keep going, my words gathering momentum. She's your ex. The same ex you just needed closure with. The same one you didn't even tell me you were seeing. He looked at me, visibly irritated, like I was overreacting yet again. Because, he replied, his tone exasperated, it's a mature thing to do. It shows we're both adults who have moved on. Besides, she was there for a lot of the big moments in my life. And I don't see why we should act like she's some villain just because she's an ex. The absurdity of his response was almost laughable. He wanted to celebrate our commitment, our love, by inviting the one person who symbolized everything unresolved in our relationship. And he couldn't even understand why that would hurt me. I realized then that, to him, this wasn't a betrayal. It was a mature way of handling things, a chance to flaunt his nonchalance about the past. As though he expected me to play along and smile while he paraded his magnanimity in front of our friends and family. Tom, this is our wedding, I said, my voice wavering. It's supposed to be about us. Our future, not your past. Not Sarah. Why can't you see how much this hurts me? He sighed, rolling his eyes slightly, as though I was being petty. I get it, okay? I know you don't like her. But it's not like I'm still hung up on her or something. This isn't about you. It's about letting go of old baggage. It's symbolic, you know, so we can show everyone we're all adults here. That I'm not some jerk who cut her out of his life for no reason. There it was again, that hint that somehow I was the one holding onto resentment. That his decision to maintain ties with her was some proof of his emotional maturity. He was painting me as the insecure one, the petty, jealous fiancé who couldn't rise above the past. I felt my anger simmering beneath the surface, bubbling up as I realized just how little he cared about my feelings. How thoroughly he was willing to dismiss me to justify his own twisted sense of loyalty. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, to keep my voice from breaking. So, you want her there because you think it makes you look good? Is that it? You want to show off how mature you are, how you're the bigger person. But what about me, Tom? What about how I feel? He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flash of irritation, of frustration. Like he couldn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of this. Honestly, I think you're being unreasonable. It's just one day. She's not going to ruin anything. I don't see why this is such a big deal to you. His words stung, each one a reminder that he saw my pain as nothing more than an inconvenience. An overreaction. He wanted Sarah at our wedding, not for any practical reason, but because he thought it would reflect well on him. And to him, my hurt was simply an obstacle, a problem he had to work around to get his way. I felt the final thread of my patience snap, the weight of months of doubt and resentment crashing down on me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man I was supposed to be marrying. A man who claimed to love me yet couldn't see beyond his own ego. His own desire to cling to his past. Fine, I said quietly, my voice hollow. If that's what you think maturity is, if that's the kind of wedding you want, then maybe I'm not the one for you. He looked taken aback, as if I'd slapped him. But I couldn't bring myself to care. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as I tried to keep my composure. My hands shaking, I turned and walked out of the room, out of the conversation, leaving him alone with his self-righteous ideas of maturity. In that moment, I knew I'd reached a point of no return. I could no longer ignore the fact that the man I was supposed to marry didn't value my feelings. didn't care enough to see the hurt he was causing me. And as much as I hated to admit it, I realized that maybe this wasn't a wedding I wanted to walk into after all. That night, I lay awake in bed, feeling the weight of my own decision pressing down on me. I knew what I had to do, even if every part of me resisted the idea, clinging to a shred of hope that somehow, by some miracle, Tom would come to his senses, that he would wake up and realize just how much he'd hurt me. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, I knew deep down that he wouldn't. He'd made his position clear, and his commitment to Sarah, or whatever part of him couldn't let her go, was stronger than his commitment to me. I could still hear the faint sounds of his voice from the other room as he spoke to his friends on the phone, probably recounting our argument with his own spin. I imagined him downplaying it, shrugging it off like some trivial misunderstanding, painting me as the insecure fiancé who couldn't handle his mature decision to befriend his ex. Just thinking about it made my heart ache, my frustration mounting with each passing minute. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I made my choice. I needed space to think, time to process everything. The wedding needed to be paused, maybe permanently. I was terrified to say it, to make it real, but I knew I couldn't go on pretending that everything was okay, that I could live with his idea of maturity. When Tom walked into the kitchen that morning, he was met with a version of me I'm not sure he recognized. I was calm, my voice steady, but every word felt like it was tearing something out of me. I think we need to put the wedding on hold, I said, barely able to meet his gaze. I can't go into this with all of these unresolved issues between us. I need time to figure out if this is really what I want. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me in disbelief. His shock quickly morphed into anger, his face hardening as he processed what I'd said. Are you serious? He demanded, his voice rising. You're going to throw away our entire relationship over one little thing? Because I wanted to be kind to someone from my past? His reaction was exactly what I feared it would be. He couldn't see that it was so much more than a little thing. He still didn't understand, and the fact that he couldn't see the hurt he'd caused, even now, only confirmed the decision I was making. Yes, I replied, my voice trembling but resolute. I can't move forward when I feel like my feelings don't matter to you. When it feels like you're willing to protect everyone's emotions except mine. He shook his head, his expression one of pure frustration. This is ridiculous, he said. I can't believe you're letting jealousy and insecurity ruin what we have. I thought you were stronger than this. More trusting. I never thought you'd be so controlling. The words stung, each one hitting like a slap. Here I was, pouring my heart out, telling him the deepest, most vulnerable truths about my feelings. And all he could see was his own victimhood, his own sense of being wronged. He saw me as the obstacle, the unreasonable partner who was daring to question his decisions. I felt my voice rising, unable to hold back the tidal wave of anger and hurt that had been building up. Controlling? Jealous? Do you even hear yourself? Tom? I am not the one who went behind your back. I am not the one who's still clinging to some romanticized version of the past. You're the one who lied, who hid things, and now you're making me the villain because I have a problem with it? My words seemed to bounce off him, his face impassive as he stood there, arms crossed. There was a coldness in his eyes that I'd never seen before. A wall he was putting up to keep himself right and me wrong. It was a look that screamed indifference, and it cut deeper than anything he could have said. I took a shaky breath, fighting the tears that were threatening to fall. I need time to think, I said quietly. If you can't understand that, then maybe you're right. Maybe I am not the person you thought I was. And maybe that's for the best. He didn't respond, just shook his head again, a derisive smile creeping onto his face. Fine, take your time, but don't expect me to sit around waiting while you figure out whether or not you can handle a real relationship. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen. The silence around me filled with the echo of his words. I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt the clarity of my own decision washing over me, freeing me from the burden of trying to hold together something that was already falling apart. Over the next few days, I spoke with my friends and family, carefully explaining my decision. Their reactions were mixed, each one reflecting a different perspective. Some were supportive, telling me that I was right to prioritize my own happiness and well-being. That I deserved someone who respected my feelings and boundaries. Others were more cautious, suggesting that maybe I'd overreacted. That I was letting jealousy cloud my judgment. But despite their varying opinions, I knew in my heart that I was doing what I needed to do. That I was taking the first step toward reclaiming my sense of self. Tom, however, didn't make things easy. He began reaching out to our mutual friends, telling them his version of events, painting me as the unreasonable fiancé who'd called off the wedding over something silly. He told them I was controlling and insecure, that I was blowing things out of proportion and refusing to trust him. I knew he was twisting the truth, but a part of me wondered if maybe he actually believed it. If he truly saw himself as the innocent party. It was exhausting, the constant push and pull of emotions, the battle between my love for him and the hurt he'd inflicted. I found myself questioning my own judgment, wondering if I really was the problem, if my need for respect and honesty was somehow unreasonable. But every time I wavered, every time I felt the urge to go back, I reminded myself of his indifference, of the way he'd looked at me like a stranger, unable, or unwilling, to see my pain. One night, as I sat alone in our apartment, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, I realized that I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep questioning myself, couldn't keep twisting my own values to fit into his vision of what a mature relationship should be. I deserved more than a partner who made me feel like I was constantly asking for too much, who dismissed my feelings as insecurity rather than seeing them as an opportunity for us to grow. And so, I made the hardest decision of my life. I told him that I couldn't go through with the wedding, that I needed to end things once and for all. The conversation was brief, cold, and painfully final. He barely looked at me as I spoke, his expression one of quiet resignation, like he'd already accepted that I wasn't worth the effort. As I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I felt a mixture of grief and relief, the ache of a broken heart mingling with the freedom of finally being true to myself. I knew I'd made the right choice, even if it meant letting go of the future I'd once dreamed of. I realized that sometimes, loving yourself means walking away from the person you thought you'd be with forever. And as painful as it was, I knew that I was stepping into a new chapter, one where I could finally be at peace. No longer haunted by the shadows of his past or the wounds of his indifference. In the days that followed, the fallout from calling off the wedding hit me harder than I'd anticipated. The immediate relief I'd felt from finally choosing myself gave way to a strange mix of emotions, grief, guilt, and a persistent feeling of isolation. I tried to keep my focus on moving forward, but my phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family, each conversation reminding me of the mess I was leaving behind. Tom had wasted no time in telling people his version of events. Word spread quickly among our circle of friends and beyond. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion, and I found myself in the center of a storm of conflicting advice and judgments. Some were sympathetic, saying they admired my strength in walking away from a relationship that didn't feel right. They told me I deserved someone who respected my boundaries, who valued me enough not to gaslight me into doubting my own worth. Those words helped, but they were a small comfort against the weight of everything else. Then there were the others, the ones who questioned my decision, who saw Tom as a good guy, who had made a harmless mistake. I received texts and calls from friends who'd heard Tom's side, the version where I was the overly controlling fiancé who had called off a wedding over nothing. They thought I was being dramatic, that I'd overreacted, that surely Tom's meeting with Sarah was nothing but a gesture of kindness, a sign of closure. One friend, Jenna, called me one evening, her voice hesitant, as though she didn't want to tread into what had quickly become forbidden territory. I just don't understand why you couldn't talk it through. You know, Tom's a good guy. I've never seen him be anything but caring and loyal. Are you sure it wasn't just a misunderstanding? It was hard to explain to people like Jenna, who hadn't seen Tom's dismissiveness up close, who hadn't felt the sting of his indifference when he'd tried to turn my pain into my own personal flaw. I could hear the disappointment in her voice, the hint that maybe she thought I was making a huge mistake. throwing away a good man over something trivial. But I couldn't bring myself to justify my decision to everyone, to relive every moment of heartbreak just to convince them that I'd done the right thing. My family's reaction was another challenge. My mother, in particular, struggled to understand. She'd met Tom several times, liked him, and saw him as a dependable, stable partner. She was blindsided when I told her I'd called off the wedding. We sat down one afternoon, her face lined with worry as she listened to my explanation. "Are you sure you're not just going through cold feet?" she asked. Her voice gentle but persistent. "Every couple has problems, sweetie. Sometimes you have to pick your battles. Don't you think it's possible he didn't mean to hurt you?" I wanted to scream, to make her see how much this decision had cost me. But instead, I nodded quietly, trying to reassure her without compromising my own convictions. "I wish it was that simple, Mom. But this wasn't just a small issue. It was about trust and respect. He couldn't even acknowledge how much his actions hurt me. And that's something I can't overlook." She sighed, her face softening a bit as she reached for my hand. "I just want you to be happy," she said, "but I also don't want you to be alone. It's not easy finding someone who loves you." The implication stung. It was the same line of thought I'd been battling with since I made my decision. The worry that maybe I was expecting too much. That maybe I'd thrown away a chance at love because of my own unwillingness to compromise. I was torn between defending my decision and doubting it, wondering if I'd made a mistake that I'd regret for the rest of my life. And then there were Tom's friends, people I'd known, laughed with, and spent countless weekends around, who now seemed to see me as the villain in his story. They'd been swept up in his narrative, one where I was the controlling, unforgiving fiancé who'd let her insecurities ruin a perfectly good relationship. I could feel their judgment in every ignored message, every cold response, as though I'd betrayed some unspoken loyalty to Tom by daring to question his actions. The worst part was knowing that he was feeding into this narrative, actively encouraging it. I'd overheard him telling a mutual friend that I was too jealous to handle his friendships and that I needed to work through my issues before marrying anyone. Hearing him frame my hurt as some personal failing felt like a slap. A reminder that he was more focused on preserving his own reputation than accepting any responsibility for the pain he'd caused. One evening, I ran into Sarah, a friend from college, who had been in my life long before Tom entered the picture. She was one of the few people who truly listened, who let me pour my heart out without judgment. As I told her everything, the betrayal, the lies, the gaslighting, I felt an overwhelming relief. Like I was finally seen and understood. "You're right to feel hurt," she said softly, her hand resting on my shoulder. "You're not asking for too much. You're just asking for respect. And if he couldn't give you that, then maybe he wasn't the right one." Her words were a balm to my wounded pride. A reminder that I wasn't losing my mind or being unreasonable. I was simply asking for something every relationship should be built on: respect, honesty, and trust. And as much as I wanted things to work with Tom, I couldn't force him to give me something he didn't value. The days turned into weeks, each one a delicate balancing act as I navigated the conflicting reactions of those around me. The weight of the decision I'd made settled heavily on my shoulders. And there were moments when I second-guessed everything, when the loneliness of standing by my convictions felt like too much to bear. But deep down, in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I knew I'd done the right thing. I'd chosen myself, my dignity, my sense of self-worth over a relationship that had chipped away at all of those things. And even as I grappled with the judgment, the whispers, and the skepticism, I felt a sense of strength growing within me. I knew that the people who truly understood me, who valued me for who I was, would stand by me. And as for the rest, those who saw me as the villain in Tom's story, who couldn't see beyond his narrative of me as the insecure fiancé, they would fall away, leaving me with a smaller but truer circle of people who truly cared. In the end, I realized that sometimes, standing up for yourself means losing people along the way. And as painful as it was, I was beginning to accept that maybe that was okay. As the weeks stretched on, the initial sting of calling off the wedding began to dull, leaving behind something I hadn't expected: a quiet, profound sense of clarity. In the aftermath of it all, As the noise of opinions and accusations settled, I was left alone with my thoughts. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though the weight of years of self-doubt and compromise was finally beginning to lift. In this newfound silence, I started to reflect on the relationship I'd had with Tom, piecing together moments that, until now, I'd been too blinded by love or loyalty to examine. I started to see a pattern, a subtle yet undeniable thread of compromise that ran through our time together. I'd always prided myself on being easygoing, understanding, a good partner, but now, I saw that my willingness to be understanding had often come at the expense of my own feelings and boundaries. I'd spent so much time accommodating Tom, smoothing over his rough edges, trying to be the perfect partner for him, that somewhere along the way, I'd lost sight of myself. I thought back to moments that should have been red flags. Moments when Tom's dismissive comments or actions had made me feel small. But I'd convinced myself they were insignificant. Times he'd brushed off my opinions, or joked about my sensitive side, reducing my genuine feelings to quirks that he could humor rather than respect. I'd laughed it off, told myself he didn't mean anything by it, that I was reading too much into things. But now, looking back, I realized that those moments had been signs of something deeper, his lack of respect for my voice and his inability to see me as his equal. There were nights when the ache of missing him would come back, catching me off guard as I thought about the life we'd planned together. I'd find myself imagining the home we'd talked about, the trips we'd planned, the future that had once seemed so certain. It felt strange to mourn something that had never truly existed, something that was more of a dream than a reality. I'd loved the idea of him, the man I thought he could be, but that wasn't the same as loving the person he actually was. Slowly, I began to see that my choice to leave wasn't just about Tom's betrayal or his loyalty to Sarah. It was about my own journey. My realization that I needed to start respecting myself in a way that I'd been unable to in that relationship. Tom had pushed me to a breaking point. Yes. But the truth was, I'd been bending myself to fit into his world long before Sarah's message had come through. I began taking small steps to rebuild my life, things I hadn't done in years because they simply hadn't fit into our relationship. I picked up old hobbies, spent more time with friends I hadn't seen in ages, and started saying yes to things that had once felt too trivial or impractical. I even signed up for an art class, something I'd always wanted to do but had never made time for. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was making choices purely for myself, not worrying about how they would fit into someone else's plans or expectations. Through it all, I realized that this wasn't just about calling off a wedding, it was about reclaiming my own identity. I'd been so deeply entangled in Tom's world, in his needs and his vision of the future, that I'd lost sight of the person I'd wanted to become. Now, without him, I had the chance to get reacquainted with myself, to rediscover my own dreams, desires, and sense of purpose. The hardest part was forgiving myself for not seeing the signs, for compromising my values, for losing myself in the name of love. I knew I'd made mistakes, that I'd ignored my own intuition, that I'd let my desire for a stable, happy relationship cloud my judgment. But I also realized that this experience had taught me something invaluable. It had shown me what I was capable of. The strength I had to walk away from something that wasn't right for me. Even when it hurt, I felt a shift within myself, a renewed sense of self-worth. I realized that love, real love, was about mutual respect, trust, and shared values. It wasn't about one person constantly compromising, bending, and accommodating to keep the peace. I had spent so much time convincing myself that my feelings weren't important, that I was somehow less for needing security and transparency in a relationship. But now, I could see that those needs weren't flaws, they were boundaries. Boundaries that I was finally ready to enforce. As I looked back on my time with Tom, I could appreciate the lessons it had given me. He'd shown me what I didn't want, what I could no longer tolerate, and what I deserved to protect in myself. And for that, in a strange way, I was grateful. I didn't hate him, in fact. A part of me hoped he'd find whatever it was he was looking for, even if it wasn't with me. But I knew I couldn't be the one to sacrifice my own happiness to help him figure it out. In the quiet of my own space, I felt something unfamiliar but deeply comforting, a sense of peace. It was as if I'd finally come home to myself. To a version of me I hadn't realized I'd lost. I knew I had a long road ahead. That healing from this would take time. But I felt ready. For the first time in years, I felt whole, as though I'd regained a part of myself I hadn't even known was missing. And as I sat there, reflecting on everything that had brought me to this point, I felt a surge of hope. A flicker of excitement for the future. I didn't know what lay ahead. But I knew one thing. I was ready to face it on my terms. Fully and unapologetically myself. In the weeks that followed, I found myself growing stronger. Steadier in the quiet resolve I'd found. The more distance I put between myself and the life I'd planned with Tom, the more I began to see things clearly. I'd walked away from a relationship that had cost me pieces of myself. And while I still felt the ache of leaving behind what we'd built, I could see now that it had been the right decision. One day, as I was tidying up the last of Tom's things, an old sweater he'd left behind, a few stray photos, I felt a profound sense of closure. I'd already given back the engagement ring. A moment that had been surprisingly freeing rather than painful. It felt like I was returning something that no longer represented who I was or what I wanted. And as I sorted through the remnants of our relationship, I knew that the real parting gift he'd given me wasn't material. It was clarity, a newfound understanding of my own boundaries, my values, and what I needed to feel secure and loved. Still, a part of me wondered if he'd ever truly understood why I'd left. He'd sent a few messages after the breakup, attempts at rekindling or, more accurately, reeling me back in with the same old lines about me being too sensitive, or reading too much into things. He'd even suggested that I was throwing away our future over my insecurities. Clearly believing he'd done nothing wrong and that I'd come to regret leaving him. The messages hurt, as they were meant to, but each one reminded me of the reason I'd chosen to walk away. I didn't reply. I knew it would only lead to more accusations. More attempts to twist the narrative to make me doubt myself again. But as time went on, I realized I didn't need him to understand. I didn't need anyone else to validate my decision. This journey was mine, and it wasn't about convincing him or anyone else of my worth. The life I was stepping into didn't require permission, validation, or approval. It only required my commitment to myself. I started focusing on the things that brought me joy, things that I'd pushed aside to prioritize the relationship. I spent time reconnecting with friends, building relationships that felt honest, supportive, and full of the love and respect I hadn't felt with Tom. My friends became my anchors, reminding me of who I was and encouraging me to trust myself, to believe in the person I was becoming. Slowly, I found myself opening up, allowing myself to dream again, to imagine a future that was no longer defined by compromise and self-sacrifice. One evening, as I sat outside with a notebook in my lap, jotting down some of the goals I'd neglected for so long, a quiet confidence settled over me. I realized that I didn't need to be afraid of being alone. In fact, the solitude felt empowering, freeing. I no longer had to temper my needs or tiptoe around someone else's insecurities. For the first time in years, I felt in complete control of my own life, able to define who I was and what I wanted without anyone else's influence. There was a beautiful simplicity in this newfound independence. I was no longer questioning myself, no longer bending and compromising to fit into someone else's idea of love. And as I continued to reflect, I felt a quiet sense of pride in my decision. Walking away from Tom had been the hardest thing I'd ever done. But it had also been the bravest. It had taken courage to put myself first, to demand the respect I deserved. And I knew that courage would carry me forward. I didn't want to dwell on Tom, on what he might think or how he might feel. This wasn't about him. This was about reclaiming my life and my happiness. And as I looked around at the small but beautiful life I was creating for myself, I knew I was finally free from his expectations, from his judgments, and from the hold he'd had over my sense of self-worth. The wedding that would never be was no longer a loss, it was a blessing. A reminder of the path I'd chosen not to walk. I felt grateful for the chance to redefine my life, for the clarity that had come from one of the most painful decisions I'd ever made. I could see now that the love I'd been seeking was within me all along, waiting for me to recognize it, to nurture it, and to let it guide me into a future that felt fully my own. As I sat there, I made a promise to myself. I would never again settle for anything less than a love built on respect, trust, and genuine partnership. I would hold on to this strength, this independence, and remember that I was worthy of a love that lifted me up, rather than one that made me feel small. With that promise, I felt a quiet contentment, a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I knew there would still be hard days, moments of doubt, and times when I'd miss the comfort of companionship. But I also knew that I was no longer willing to trade my happiness for someone else's convenience. I was ready for whatever came next, whatever life had in store for me, because I was finally living for myself. I closed my notebook, smiled to myself, and looked out at the world with fresh eyes. I had chosen my own path, my own happiness, and that was more beautiful and fulfilling than any wedding day could have ever been. Months passed, and life unfolded in quiet, meaningful ways, each day bringing with it a newfound sense of peace, without the looming stress of a wedding or the emotional weight of an unresolved relationship. I felt lighter, as though I'd finally broken free from a cage I hadn't even realized I'd been in. With each passing day, I grew more comfortable with myself, with the idea of being alone, not lonely, but content in my own company. My routines shifted to reflect this new chapter. Mornings were now mine alone. A ritual of coffee, journaling, and the unhurried moments of stillness that I'd never known I craved. I'd always assumed I was someone who thrived in partnership, but I began to see that I was someone who could thrive independently, who could build a life that felt whole and meaningful, even without another person beside me. And as time went on, I found that the peace I felt in solitude was something I'd never felt in my relationship with Tom. My circle of friends grew smaller but richer, filled with people who truly understood me, who supported me without question. I reconnected with Sarah, the friend who had listened without judgment when I'd first opened up about my doubts. She became a steady presence, someone who reminded me of who I was before I'd lost myself in the relationship. We spent weekends exploring local art shows, discovering cozy bookshops, or just talking late into the night, unraveling the tangles of our own hearts and dreams. It was healing, more than I could have imagined, to surround myself with people who saw me for who I was and valued me for it. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out some old boxes, I came across a stack of wedding invitations I'd never sent. Seeing them made me pause, the reminder of a life I'd once imagined. But rather than sadness, I felt a quiet pride. I'd made the decision to choose myself over a relationship that didn't serve me. And I knew now that it had been the bravest thing I could have done. I carefully folded the invitations and put them back in the box. A small, unspoken ritual of closure. That life was behind me now. A chapter I had no need to revisit. My friends had begun to notice the shift in me too. They commented on how relaxed I seemed, how much more myself I was. Even my mother, who'd struggled to understand my decision initially, could see the transformation. She told me one day, her voice filled with pride, that I seemed happier, that I looked more at peace. Hearing those words from her meant more than I could say. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement that I'd made the right choice, that I was on the right path. In the quiet moments, I'd catch myself daydreaming about the future, a future that was all mine to shape. I allowed myself to imagine a life that was vibrant and full of adventure, unburdened by the compromises I'd once made. I no longer needed someone else's approval or validation. I trusted myself to make choices that honored my own values and needs. And as much as I once feared the idea of being single, I now found it empowering. My days were filled with small joys, moments of creativity, spontaneous decisions, the freedom to explore without worrying about someone else's expectations. I'd started writing again, pouring my thoughts onto paper, rediscovering passions I hadn't nurtured in years. I felt as if I was finally embracing the parts of myself I'd suppressed in my relationship with Tom. Pieces of me that were now blooming in the light of my own independence. Occasionally, people would ask if I'd heard from him, if there had been any last-minute pleas or apologies. But there had been none. He'd moved on, as I knew he would, never reaching out for closure or understanding. I realized that I didn't need those things from him. That I'd given myself closure the moment I walked away. And I was okay with that. His silence, once a source of pain, now felt like a gift. An open door leading me further into the life I was creating. One evening, as the sun set and cast a warm glow over my apartment, I sat by the window, looking out at the world that felt both familiar and new. I thought about everything I'd been through, all the hard lessons and quiet victories, and felt a surge of gratitude. I'd learned that love wasn't just about finding someone to share your life with. It was about finding the courage to be whole on your own. To trust yourself. To value your own happiness above the need to belong to someone else. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. A vow of sorts. I would continue to live honestly, fully, and unapologetically. I would trust myself to set boundaries. To say no when something didn't serve me. To say yes to the things that brought me joy. I would welcome love if and when it came. But I would never again lose myself in the process. As I watched the last light of the day fade, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. I was ready for whatever lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that I'd found my way back to myself. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be.